It's Philosophy Talk.
Islamic extremists carried out a deadly targeted attack on the offices of the satirical French magazine Charlie Hebdo.
The power and perils of satire.
Trying to strike a blow against free expression, the right to offend.
Should there be limits on what can be satirized?
Francis thinks we shouldn't mock religion. Who does he think he is? The Pope?
Look, if we suddenly start shying away from mocking the French with tired stereotypes, the terrorists win.
Doesn't free speech guarantee our right to poke fun at anyone we want?
Comedy is tragedy plus time. See, when the night Lincoln was shot, you couldn't joke about it. You couldn't make a joke about that. You just couldn't do it. Now, time has gone by, and now it's fair game. See what I mean? It's tragedy plus time.
Our guest is Jane Kirtley, director of the Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law at the University of Minnesota.
The power and perils of satire. Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're here at the studios of KALW San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner at Stanford, where Ken teaches philosophy, and I did for 40 wonderful years.
Yeah, John, we all remember those years fondly. Today, we're thinking about the power and peril of satire.
Satire, Ken, uses humor to ridicule and shame and embarrass people, and, importantly, institutions. It can be a potent tool for exposing society's ills.
Yeah, John, I totally agree with you, especially when it comes to politicians and other powerful people. Satire is the perfect way to take them down a peg or two.
Well, I'm all for satirizing the rich and powerful, and even the moderately rich and moderately powerful. What does bother me is when people use satire to attack the poor and vulnerable and downtrodden.
Well, I see your point, John, but should we really call it satire if it's aimed at the poor and the downtrodden? Isn't that just mean-spirited hate speech or something?
Well, I don't know how we should use the word, but the way people do use the word and the way people self-consciously think of themselves when they do a lot of this hate speech is as satire. A lot of satire, or what passes for satire, is mean-spirited and hateful. Take, for example, those anti-Muslim cartoons in the French satirical rag Charlie Hebdo.
Oh, you mean the ones that got those poor cartoonists killed?
Yeah, I mean, truly mean-spirited, nasty stuff. But satire, everybody calls it.
Yeah, but I'm sure you agree. I don't care how vicious the cartoons were. Surely nobody deserves to die over a few cartoons, John, right?
Yes, Ken, I actually do agree with you that we shouldn't go around murdering people for drawing cartoons. But I still think Charlie Hebdo, although they didn't deserve what they got, still, they went too far. Have you actually seen their cartoons?
Oh, I have. I took a good look at a whole bunch of them. They never hold back, John. It's no holds barred. They target everybody with the same level of viciousness. It's not just Muslims. It's Catholics and it's Jews too. They've been doing this forever, and they've been banned in France because of it at times. They even had one cartoon of Pope Francis wearing a skimpy Mardi Gras bikini, dancing on the streets of Rio. I'm sure the Pope didn't like it, but if religion isn't fair game for satire, I don't know what is.
Well, there's a big difference between ridiculing the Pope in a country that's traditionally Catholic and ridiculing Muhammad when Muslims are clearly in France an oppressed minority.
But you're not saying that we can only ridicule the dominant religion of a country, are you? I mean, why think that?
No, but I do think that when you, just as you said, when you ridicule oppressed groups, and the Muslims in minority in France is such a group, maybe it shouldn't be called satire. It really is, according to you, hate speech.
No, that wasn't my point. It's only hate speech if it's directed at the powerless. And Islam is not powerless. It's a pretty potent force in the world. It's the state religion in many countries. Islamic extremists are wreaking havoc all over the place. Moderate Muslims in France and elsewhere probably took offense to Charlie Hebdo. But you know what they need to do? They need to grow a thicker skin. That's what they need to do.
Well, even America, we recognize that sometimes freedom of expression has to be limited. You're not free to threaten people, incite violence, defame character. There's other examples where we justifiably impose limits on what people can say.
Yeah, I grant you that, but in all those kind of examples, the reason we limit freedom of expression is because the speech in question could bring about serious harm to people. And, yeah, I agree. Your right to not be harmed by others trumps their right to say whatever they want.
Exactly.
No, not exactly. What's the harm in a little satire?
Well, I'm not talking about mere offense and discomfort. I'm talking about real harm. When satire targets society's marginalized, all it does is confirm people's prejudices about the group in question, and that leads to further harms, discrimination in jobs or housing, or often violence.
Gosh, John, you think a few cartoons can do all that? I think you're seriously overestimating the actual power of satire.
Well, in preparation for this program, I reviewed a lot of the cartoons of African Americans and American Indians in the 19th century, continuing the 20th century. I think you're seriously underestimating the peril of satire directed at minorities who are in danger.
Look, I'm going to grant you that where politics and satire meet, things actually can get very heated. And so we sent our roving philosophical reporter, Shukun Kalantari, to talk to political satirists about how they themselves draw the line between comedy and hate speech. She files this report.
For generations, presidents have been the subject of satire.
I'm here this evening appearing on the bill with Mr. Hoover. So now I expect you won't hear any more of Amos and Andy. It'll just be Hoover and Rogers from now on.
But when the Twin Towers were hit on September 11th, 2001, the country was in mourning. George W. Bush went from being a political punching bag to a revered national leader.
And then you couldn't talk about Bush at all. To impugn the president was giving the terrorists a foot rub.
Will Durst is a political satirist in San Francisco. After the 9/11 shine faded, he joked a lot about Bush.
Ethics eluding, preemptory invading of a country that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, 35-day vacation taking, domestic spying, CIA...
He went on like this for about a minute and a half.
I would get people coming up afterwards saying that it was unpatriotic. In these dark times, America has to pull together.
Durst says the key to good political satire is to make fun of people in power. That way you're punching up, not punching down.
I don't believe in mocking or scoffing or taunting the people who are less fortunate. Afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted.
And I just love that idea that the comfortable are sort of put off, by a joke.
That's Francesca Fiorentini. She's a comedian and the host of a comedy news show on Al Jazeera Plus.
Clinton, Bush, Trump. Wife, brother, racist uncle-in-law after one too many. The who's who of Washington and the 1% are running for president in 2016. But they're not dynasties, they're dynasties.
My target, at least, in terms of who I make fun of, tends to be those in power and tends to be, those with privilege. And I think they deserve it, they can take it. But I'm not about to start making fun of homeless people. And I'm not about to make fun of, people of color for asking to be brutalized by the police or something like this.
Fiorentini says that kind of punching down happened a lot after 9/11. In the media and among comedians.
I went to a comedy show after 9/11 in New York City, and I was floored because every single comic was incredibly racist. Anti-Arab racism all over the map.
That doesn't mean that all jokes about the Middle East or Islam are off the table. Fiorentini just says they should be thought-provoking, or at least not outright racist.
I'm working on something around ISIS, talking about how ISIS almost makes you miss Al-Qaeda. It's like the way Justin Bieber almost makes you miss 98 Degrees. Nobody misses 98 Degrees.
Both Fiorentini and Will Durst think comedy makes people pay more attention to politics. Durst says when people laugh, they're more receptive to new thoughts and ideas.
Because I think people, when they're laughing and drinking and having a good time, you can drop seeds of doubt and, maybe propose an alternate direction or philosophy, but my job is to make them laugh out loud on purpose against their will, which is tough enough already.
Do you have a political joke you think can make the folks in our studio laugh? Email it to us at comments@philosophytalk.org, and we'll publish the best ones on our blog. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Shuka Kalantari.
Thanks, Shuka, for exposing us to some real satirists and some real issues involving satire. I'm John Perry, and with me is my fellow Stanford philosopher, Ken Taylor.
And today, we're thinking about the power and peril of satire. We're joined now by Jane Kirtley. She's a professor of journalism at the University of Minnesota Law School, where she's also the director of the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law. Jane, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Thank you. My pleasure to be with you.
Jane, how did you first get interested in media ethics in particular?
Well, ethics per se, I guess I would say, goes all the way back to my formative years when I was raised as a Congregationalist in the Midwest, and I was taught that conscience was all. Your personal conscience was everything, not dogma. So I had to struggle with everything along the way, and that included when I was working on my school newspapers and the kind of decisions that we made editorially about what we would and would not cover, because our teachers pretty much left us alone, really came back to me that ultimately I was responsible for what I did. So as I moved through as a journalist and then as a lawyer and as a media lawyer, I started to realize that the First Amendment gave journalists tremendous power and tremendous freedom to engage in commentary, reporting, and so forth. But if they didn't have an editorial and an ethical compass, that the result would be that they weren't fulfilling their obligations that I think they have as a result of the First Amendment.
Well, I think virtually all the deep thinkers in America are former Congregationalists like you and I. Now, we just heard Will Durst on a Roving Philosophical Report say that in comedy, you should punch up rather than punch down. In other words, you should attack those with power and privilege, but not those without. Do you agree with that?
In one sense, I would agree. I think that certainly those in power and institutions that are powerful are very clearly fair game for the satirist thrust. I mean, that's what they're there to do, to deflate the pompous and those who don't deserve to be exerting power and influence over the public. So I would absolutely agree with that. But I think part of what's happened in the Charlie Hebdo discussion has been conflating this idea that an attack on a symbol that is highly regarded by an oppressed minority is an attack on that minority, and I disagree with that. So I would agree in part with what you've said, but I would scale that back to say an attack on an individual is not the same thing as an attack on an institution.
But let me ask this. I mean, so you see a picture of Muhammad, and of course you're not supposed to depict Muhammad according to the Muslims. He's naked. He's on his front with his bare rear end up in the air, waiting for someone to sodomize him. Now, that's certainly an attempt to hurt the feelings and embarrass and cause pain in an oppressed minority, isn't it?
Might be, but it might also be, and this is what I would argue it is, it's an attempt to call attention to the fact that an object or an individual or the image of an individual is being viewed as so sacred that it's not subject to any kind of satirical commentary. I mean, as you said, among some Muslims, although not all, any depiction of the Prophet, however pleasant it would be, however deferential and reverential it would be, is forbidden. They're basically taking this and turning it on its head, as it were, and saying, we're not even going to do something that looks like 14th century Muslim art. We're instead going to take it to the most extreme example to shock and to cause commentary. And to me, that's not an attack on the individual adherents. It's an attack on the institution.
Well, I might even go further than you, but we will, because I think I have a more extreme view than even you, but we'll talk about this after the break. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today, we're thinking about the power and the peril of satire with Jane Kirtley from the University of Minnesota Law School.
Is there a clear line between hate speech and vicious satire? Are there any topics that should be off limits for the satirist? How far is too far?
Satire, hate speech, and freedom of expression. Plus your calls and emails when Philosophy Talk continues.
About that bass, don't panic.
We're all
about that bass, who embrace organics.
We're all about the bass as we chase Hispanics. We all gotta say face with that bass.
Political satire in America, power without peril. But what about elsewhere in the world? It certainly wasn't the case for Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor, and we're thinking about the power and peril of satire.
Our guest is Jane Kirtley, director of the Center for the Study of Media Ethics at the University of Minnesota.
So, Jane, you and John seem to agree with something, that there's some line that you shouldn't cross. You seem to have a different view about where that line might be, but I want to put an example to you. I think I may disagree with both you and John. I'm just not sure. Suppose I think affirmative action is diminishing blacks somehow, or women, whoever is the recipient of affirmative action. And I want to represent the way I think affirmative action is diminishing those folks. I mean, I don't believe this. Suppose I did. And I took a satirical tone about, black people who get things they don't deserve and get in positions they're not ready for. And I made jokes about that. I mean, it seems to me that both you and John, for different reasons perhaps, think there's something deeply wrong with that. I mean,
I wouldn't think there was something deeply wrong with that, because I think what you would be satirizing is what you see as a social problem, a social and political problem. You're not beating up on any particular individual. The distinction I would draw is when a newspaper, for example, or a television show, but it's more likely to be a newspaper account, decides to put a human face on some issue, whether it's welfare fraud or the inadequacy of welfare, whatever it is. What do? They personalize it by having a particular story that they tell, because that is something people can identify with. Straight news story done for the purposes of informing the public. Not a satirical issue here, but I guess the distinction I'm drawing is they're singling out that single person to make a point. If you're satirizing that person in your piece, I might have a problem with that. But if you're talking about the way the system operates, I don't have any trouble with that at all, even though the people that you're criticizing, at least indirectly, are the recipients of that welfare or whatever the case might be.
Well, Ken, I think, as usual, I have a somewhat more nuanced view than you give me credit for.
Okay, well, I wasn't sure. That's why, I wasn't trying to...
you've got every right to express your political opinion about affirmative action, and you have every right to do that with a cartoon. And, we got to make some distinctions here. One is should you be prevented from publishing it by some governmental agency? But a much different issue is, should you be criticized for doing it in a way that is immoral, causes harm, and needless discomfort? I mean, if you decide to do it by a cartoon that takes say a picture of a black person in the most, Amos and Andy blackface,
right,
slavery times depiction, and maybe shows him lynching a white taxpayer. To me, I don't think the government has the right to prevent you from publishing that. But as a publisher, I wouldn't publish it because I think it's needlessly cruel. It's likely to inflame really unprincipled people. And so to me, it shows, like a lot of action, bad character traits on your part. And I don't think the fact that it's speech or cartoons should eliminate that criticism. I think it's wrong.
Yeah, Jane,
to do that.
Yeah, Jane, what do you think about what John... That's a complicated thought John just said.
It is complicated, and I am not going to buy into this idea that causing hurt to someone is the equivalent of inflaming other people to undesirable action or to violence. I think those are two distinct things, and I would draw a clear distinction, as the law does, between those two things. There's a huge difference between inciting people to engage in harmful conduct and hurting somebody's feelings. And under U.S. law, which I think is an ethical position as well, hurting somebody's feelings is much less likely to be protected in terms of protected from some kind of legal retaliation than inciting violent action. If you're going to incite, if you're going to threaten, that is not going to be protected under the First Amendment. If you're just hurting somebody's feelings, that's something that we honor in this country. We have a long tradition of allowing people to take on difficult issues in ways that may hurt the susceptible, may hurt their feelings, but that don't result in violent action.
Well, yeah, but you're just missing the point I made. I'm not talking about the government intervention. I'm talking about morality and what's right and wrong to do. And just hurting people's feelings in itself isn't bad. And there's certainly a distinction between hurting people's feelings and inciting riots or violence. But the question is, if you have a message and you present it in such a way that's designed to demean and marginalize and hurt people's feelings, haven't you done something wrong? Haven't you done something that a civilized person wouldn't do? And just because it's speech, shouldn't the only person in America today who has any audience who will call you to task is Jon Stewart. The rest of us are craven about criticizing anybody for exercising their free speech. But free speech, whether it causes big harms or little harms, is perfectly criticizable and can be wrong.
What do you think, Jane?
I certainly think people can make mistakes in judgment when they engage in speech, but for me it becomes a very dangerous decision when we say, well, this could hurt somebody's feelings, so we better not say it. Sometimes big issues require that people have to confront their demons and they have to confront their sacred cows. And it may be hurtful for them to go through that process. In my discussions with students in my classes who are Muslim, we've had a lot of discussion about how they regard attacks on what they see as attacks on the Prophet and how it is tremendously hurtful to them personally. And I accept that. I understand that. I respect that. But that doesn't mean that the topic should be off limits, even to satirical commentary, because as we've discussed for the last 20 minutes, satire is a very powerful way to get people to engage with uncomfortable ideas.
But Jane, I think, though, I'm not sure if you and John are talking to or somewhat past each other, because I think there's something different. I mean, hurt feelings are one thing, but I'm going to talk about social hurt, right? But because a certain opinion gaining wide currency doesn't just govern thought. It governs how people relate to you. It governs how people regard you. Being marginalized in a society. So Muslims being marginalized in French society, their religion not being all that sort of stuff isn't just a matter of their having hurt feelings. So they can actually, words and the consequences of words, I think John would agree, can have kind of concrete kind of harm without inciting violence, but just by marshaling people to treat you in ways and regard you in ways that you wouldn't like.
Well, let me concede that words and stereotypes and characterizations can be very harmful. I was in Rwanda a few years ago where they obviously still talk about the genocide there. The role that radio had in inflaming violent reactions and xenophobic and racist kinds of reactions is clear and documented. It can certainly happen. But here's the thing. It happens in society where speech is controlled and when those with opposing viewpoints don't have an opportunity to be heard. And I accept your premise up to a point that many of the Muslims in France, for example, are oppressed, whatever that exactly means. But the fact remains that there are options available to them to speak out, to speak back, and I really would wish that they would engage rather than responding by saying the only recourse we have is violence, to say instead the remedy for the speech we don't like is more speech, is counter speech, to make our case in a way that will be as persuasive as you are suggesting these cartoons would be.
Yeah, well, that's, the First Amendment and Second Amendment people are similar in that regard. The Second Amendment people say the solution for the gun problem is more guns. And you can perfectly say, well, the solution for people being hurt by speech is they should develop the capacity not to be hurt by speech. Or they should develop the capacity to use satire themselves. But my point is that when somebody has a cartoon of somebody having sexual intercourse with the wound in John F. Kennedy's head to make a point, I'm sure that the point could be made in a better way without hurting people in the way that depiction does. Why would they want to hurt Mrs. Kennedy in that way? It's not that it should be illegal, but it's just plain wrong.
Okay, let's let some callers in here. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about the power and peril of satire with Jane Kirtley from the University of Minnesota and George from San Francisco's on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, George.
Thank you. We could admit right away that we could get stuck on whether some satire is beneficial and some is not. And we could go around and around for the rest of the hour on whether or not some amount or some kinds of satire is permissible. But let's take this from a slightly different point of view and observe that we're asking, is it okay to think? Because what we're discussing here is actually censorship. We're saying, here's your brain, learn to use it. And on the other side of the scale, we're saying it's too dangerous to use your brain. Leave that up to experts. We'll do the thinking.
Well, George, I'm not quite sure what the question there is. I take it this way, Jane. I take George's question this way. Thanks for the call, George. Tell me if look, I can think anything I want. I don't think John wants to control my thoughts. Okay. Now, what does the expression of a thought add? Right? It makes the thought public. Okay. Is it okay to hold certain thoughts, but then not okay to express them? I'm not talking about cause to action, incitement. It's hard for me to figure out how you could have the kind of speech control that the moral speech control that John wants without also having thought control. And if I'm free to think, I should be free to say what I think. That's how I sort of took George's question, and it may not be what he had in mind, but what would you respond to that?
I think my view would be, of course you're free to think, and I would hope you're free to express your thought. What you are not free to do or to be is to be free of criticism yourself for expression of that thought. I mean, that's the construct. I mean, John or Ken, either of you, have every right to say that piece of satire goes too far, or that piece of satire pulled its punches and as a result was not very good satire. Because, as William Rehnquist, former chief of the Supreme Court, said in the case involving Reverend Jerry Falwell and Hustler magazine, the only really good satire is the satire that really hurts the subject. If it doesn't do that, it's not effective. Now, you might not agree with that, but that was his view, and I share it. I think that there's a lot of really lousy satire out there. Look at almost any April Fool's issue in a high school or college newspaper, and you'll see a lot of really bad satire. And to me, that's a much bigger sin than satire that is too sharp, too pointed. In other words, that it actually achieves its goal, which is to force people to think very hard about their most closely held, most sacred viewpoints.
So, John, I want to put a question to you. So if I'm free to think, whatever, but not free from subject to criticism, if you forbid me from expressing these dark thoughts of mine about the other and blah, 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 then you don't get a chance to confront them. So I think I kind of side with Jane. You said it's like the Second Amendment. More guns, the Second Amendment people think, will prevent harm. More speech, Jane says, will counteract the harmful tendency. And I think she's kind of right, because once I express a untoward opinion, I get subject to public criticism. I get subject to fighting back. And if I hold it but don't express it, nobody ever knows.
Yeah, well, maybe you get subject to public criticism. I mean, if you look at the depiction of American Indians through the 19th century, which led to them basically almost being exterminated and the loss of, huge amounts of lands and rights, well, who was sticking up for them? Yeah, who was doing the satirizing in the other way? Nobody. And I don't think that should. I think so. Censorship. That's a funny word. I think it means not permitting people to publish or say what they think. And by and large, I'm not in favor of it. But boy, I taught my kids to censor their speech and censor their thoughts. And I taught my grandparents, too. I said, don't use the N-word around me. That's disgusting. And so I don't see anything wrong with censorship in that sense. And when the mantle of freedom of speech says, oh, my God, you can't criticize someone and say that they're wrong for stating their opinion, I can say. I said they shouldn't have the opinion, but if they have the opinion, they should pick some way to state it that isn't unnecessarily harmful and hurtful. I don't think Charlie Hebdo did that.
Okay, I get your point, but I still think the problem with the Native Americans in the example you gave is that they didn't have access to the means of public discussion, right? You said who was speaking up for it. So in a democracy, I think what we should do is make the means of public expression accessible to all so that all points of view can be heard, so that arguments back and forth can be made. What do you think of that, Jane?
I absolutely agree with that. I think one of the great examples that underscores what you're talking about is in the former Yugoslavia during the communist years. The ethnic strife was driven underground. People could not express it, either satirically or otherwise. After the communists were kicked out, what happened? The country blew up. Now, obviously, there were a lot of reasons that contributed to that, but my own belief is that speech is a wonderful safety valve, both in terms of allowing people to express thoughts that we might think are immoral or improper or dangerous, and the opportunity for people to take them on and to counter them. That's how you deal with these bad speech, bad problems, bad thoughts. You don't drive them underground. I think that actually gives them a lot more power than exposing them to the sunshine of debate and discussion.
Art in Berkeley's on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Art. We may answer your question after the break, but state it now.
Okay. Hi, I'm reading a review in the New York Review of Books, Dark Mirror, the Medieval Origins of Anti-Jewish Iconography. You know, in my opinion, in this debate, I think really the onus is on the listener to know when something is so stupid that they shouldn't even listen to it or not take it seriously. However, the history of this anti-Jewish iconography, even up through Dickens and Fagin, is that millions and millions of people were killed, displaced. It was, the consequences were horrible. So this is a dichotomy that occurs with me all the time. I know I want free speech. I want to put the onus on the listener, but sometimes the listeners can't make the decisions, and the government takes the people in power or the satirists, whoever is doing the satirization, use that fact, and the consequences are horrible.
So what do you think, Jane? Thanks for the call, Art. What do you think?
Well, let's think about for a minute something like the Nazi propaganda film, The Eternal Jew, which had every conceivable Jewish stereotype in it in an extremely negative way. Powerful propaganda, right? But in free societies, countered immediately by counter speech. The power of it in Nazi Germany was that there was no way for there to be counter speech. So for me, the answer goes back to what I keep saying like a broken record, which is counter speech is the remedy for this, and that can really only happen in a free society.
Well, yeah, but I think there's some myths here. Nazi Germany came about from the Weimar Republic, where there was freedom of speech, and where Nazi propaganda was not driven underground. And it would be nice if the answer was that it's always better to let people say these hateful things, express them in public, open up newspapers, and just avoid criticizing them or censoring them. But empirically, I don't see any evidence of that. And I have no problem at all with the current German government saying you can't publish Mein Kampf because it just ties into too many hateful things.
So we'll have to take this up after a break. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about the power and peril of satire with Jane Kirtley from the University of Minnesota Law School.
What's an appropriate response to hateful satire? Do we need laws to limit what satirists can say? Or should satirists be completely free to ridicule whomever and whatever they want in any way they want?
How to be an ethical satirist? Or is that an oxymoron? When Philosophy Talk continues.
If anyone understands the power and peril of satire, it's Randy Newman. Even though Short People was a hit single, he got death threats because of it. Luckily, all the would-be assassins were so short they only hit him in the knee. That's a joke, folks. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Accept your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. I think people misunderstood the satire, and he wasn't satirizing short people. He was satirizing bigots is what he was doing.
Exactly.
Our guest is Jane Kirtley from the University of Minnesota Law School, and we're talking about the power and peril of satire.
Jane, as an expert on media ethics, we're going to ask you to come up with some guidelines for the ethical satirist. What advice would you offer the satirist who doesn't want to be a complete jerk?
Well, I can't think of any true satirist who isn't going to be a jerk sometimes. I'm very reluctant to try to set up a set of guidelines for anybody. It's like meeting with editorial cartoonists and trying to set up guidelines for them because so much of it is really situational. But having said that, I would say, and this may seem counterintuitive, that the more outrageous your satire, probably the more successful it is, because it needs to be founded on fact that you're going to skew slightly in a way to make your point, your satirical point. So outrageousness for me is a standard that I'm very comfortable with, because outrageousness is enough to make people make the double take and say, oh, you can't mean that literally. You can't mean that to be taken seriously. So that would be my benchmark for satirical standards. Beyond that, can I just add that and this may not be something that everyone would agree with, but I believe it to be true, that on some level, I think the satirist actually has to believe what he or she is arguing. We see enough internet trolls who take positions just for the fun of taking the position, and it falls flat, doesn't it? I mean, you immediately know that it's not ringing true because that can't be a belief that they sincerely hold. And of course, then they'll fall back and say, oh, I didn't mean it seriously, I was being satirical. So good satire is founded in a true belief.
So, Jane, it sounds to me like, let's bracket the law. We could have complicated debates about what the law should and shouldn't prohibit. John wasn't making a point about law. He was making a point about decency, I think, really. But it sounds to me like you really think that when it comes to satire, anything goes, that the satirist actually should be willing to be what John would regard as indecent. It's part of what it comes with the turf, right? Have the bravery to be indecent.
I think so. It takes a lot of courage to be a good satirist, because you have to be prepared to not only take on the institutions that many people hold sacred, but to be able to defend your reason for doing that. And that reason, I think, is always going to be predicated on the idea, not that nothing is sacred, but the idea that it's important enough that it deserves examining from all angles, not just from a reverential angle, but from a very irreverent angle. And that's what good satire is all about. It is going to hurt people who have closely held, sincerely held beliefs to the contrary. That's just the way it is.
But now I ask you something. So there are a growing number of philosophers and other kinds of thinkers who think that speech itself can be, let's call it marginalizing, not just because it insults people, but because it configures their social being in a certain way, in a certain kind of negative way, and diminishes their opportunities. Catherine McKinnon thought that pornographic representations of women did this kind of thing. That it wasn't just a representation; it was a representation that configured people in a certain way, and it was part of power dynamics and oppression and all that sort of stuff. I'm wondering whether you give any kind of credence to that kind of view of the power of speech and other representations to, in itself, just by its representations, marginalize people. Because that would be one reason why people think you shouldn't satirize the downtrodden, because you're marginalizing further the already marginalized.
Well, I disagree very strongly with Catherine McKinnon. I have to teach her writings in my constitutional theory seminar, but I disagree with them very strongly because I think that she is wrong. I'll put it as simply as that. I don't think that's right. To me, this is trying to suggest that the powers of freedom of speech that have helped to make this country, for good or ill, what it is, are somehow problematic because they were drafted and put together by rich white men 200 years ago, and that we should therefore assume that by their very nature they're going to be discriminatory against people who don't fall into that particular group. I disagree with that. I think it was genius that gave us the First Amendment and First Amendment philosophy, and I think, again, that the best remedy for the problems that may be caused in terms of people's status, their progress in society, their educational opportunities, or whatever it is to open up those doors as widely as possible and encourage every viewpoint to be heard and fully aired, let's have a debate. And one of the things that scares me more than anything else in the academic community these days is that we're backing off from that and suggesting that somehow if speech makes students uncomfortable, well, then we shouldn't engage in that speech. We should make it possible for them to go into a safe zone where they don't have to engage with the questions and problems that disturb them. If a liberal education is about anything, it has to be about confronting the very things that you hold most dear, examining them, and trying to figure out, for your own standards, whether you've made the right decisions along the way or not.
Well, let me give you an example that's pretty much a historical example from my own experience. So you've got affirmative action at Stanford. Stanford, unlike Berkeley and the University of California, is not prohibited from using affirmative action, and it does. We have a good population of African Americans, higher than Berkeley than other universities. So scenario one, both of which happen, you have somebody write an editorial in the Stanford Review that's opposed to affirmative action. Fine. Scenario two, it's the day that new students arrive. Somebody stands outside of a dorm with a sign that says, "We don't need ignorant African Americans, go home." Now, on my view, that's unacceptable. It might be impossible for a public university to prohibit that. So I was told by law school professors. But I think Stanford should prohibit it, should expel the student who did it. And I think Charlie Hebdo is kind of just on a par with that student. They could have made their point about the depiction of Muhammad being a perfectly reasonable thing to do without doing it in a gross, crass, offensive, hurtful way. And the student could have too. And, of course, Stanford eventually said, "Screw you, Perry, we won't do that."
Well, if you're
don't you think there's a line that can be drawn?
As far as the student sign is concerned, I would argue that that's not satire. That's an expression of a political viewpoint, one that many people might find offensive, that I might find offensive. But political speech should enjoy the highest protection in terms of discourse. So I would defend the student's right to post that, even though I would disagree with the sentiment expressed there. But that's very, very different, I would argue, from what a Charlie Hebdo is doing. And again, what satire is all about is by using that really sharp thrust to make a point. I mean, double entendre there, but seriously, it's to make a point. And, you might find some of those cartoons very offensive, and I know that many American news media, for example, would not run those Charlie Hebdo cartoons under any circumstances, not because they could not legally do it, but because they thought it was morally the wrong thing to do. So you're absolutely entitled to your opinion, but I disagree with your example because I don't think you're dealing with satire with the kid with the sign.
Well, I want to broaden it just briefly. We're near the end, but I do want to ask you a broader question. It's a complicated issue because it's something you said about your reaction to Catherine McKinnon. Many people think, and I don't know if this divides left or right, but many people think that all these nude speech codes on campus and stuff like that are infantilizing, and the rise of trigger warnings and all this are infantilizing students. There's new infantilization because we think students have to be protected from mere opinion by others. It sounds like you kind of on that side of things. Am I right or wrong?
I'm very much on that side of things. I have a real problem with that. And, my husband teaches criminal law, and he says, if in law school I have to start giving trigger warnings before we do the unit on rape, I might as well just wrap it up and not even teach it at all because the law students have to learn it. I can't avoid it. That's the reality if they're going to be lawyers.
Yeah, so this is really complicated stuff. And John, are you a fan of speech codes? Do you agree with those who think that students are being infantilized? Students are.
Yeah, no, I'm not in favor of speech codes, and agree with people who make this infantilizing objection. But look, there's a difference between saying in a theater, in a normal voice, "Look, I think the theater may be on fire," and shouting "fire." And it's recognized by the Supreme Court in spite of their cowardice about so many things. And I think there's a difference between, say, printing a respectful picture of Muhammad that was okay in the 15th century, and maybe having a Muslim objecting to it in a funny and ridiculous way, which would have made Charlie Hebdo's point, and doing it in a way that I don't see any possible motivation for except hurtfulness and desire to be famous for doing things that are hurtful.
So, Jane, I'll give you just a brief last word. What's your last word to?
My last word is that, as the Supreme Court said in the Hustler magazine case, different people have different standards for what constitutes outrageousness. We have to basically protect any of this speech, because otherwise we become basically the taste patrol. The bottom line is highly offensive to some people, great humor to other people. At least it's getting people to engage with the topic, and I think that makes it very much worthwhile.
On that note, I'm going to thank you for joining. This has been a great conversation. That's no satire. I mean that sincerely. So thanks for joining us. Our guest has been Jane Kirtley. She's a professor of journalism at the University of Minnesota Law School. She's also director of the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law. So, John, you have any non-satirical thoughts, or you're prone to satire?
I have almost no non-satirical thoughts, but I'm just when people start saying things that there's no evidence for, and quoting John Stuart Mill, who was talking about political discourse, to avoid, say, outlawing the depiction of child pornography. I don't mean pornography with children. That's illegal. But depictions, cartoons of child pornography, I think the Supreme Court's refusal to consider that is just plain cowardice.
Well, yeah, it's really complicated, though. I mean,
no, it's not.
No, it is, because you've got a standard of decency working, but I don't think the law should necessarily encode your or mine or anybody else's standard of decency.
How about the standard of decency that's shared by everybody, or practically everybody? They do it in Canada. They do it in other countries.
Yeah.
There's no reason we need to be so craven about speech and guns as we are.
This conversation continues at Philosopher's Corner, at our online community of thinkers, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog. And you, too, can become a partner in that community by visiting our website, philosophytalk.org.
Now our in-house satirist finds the power and peril within his own satirical heart. It's Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes. Every week somebody on Facebook posts an article that prompts outraged comments until someone notices the article is from The Onion. People are losing the ability to recognize satire. Not only that, I read an article in the contrarian magazine The Baffler, which claimed that since President Obama, for example, has appeared with Letterman as a willing victim of a joke, even making jokes on himself, satire itself has become increasingly meaningless. George S. Kaufman once said, satire is what closes on Saturday night, but Saturday Night Live is now an institution. And it's still a growth industry, giving us all our funny movie stars, except the English and Australian ones. And what is satire? I was in a spirited discussion with a philosopher about this question. We talked about the French magazine Charlie Hebdo. Was what they did satire or racism, or both? The philosopher brought up the news item a few months back about the university students caught on video on a luxury bus in tuxedo singing a song about lynching black people. The song could be deemed satire. I said, no, it was racist bull. I also said, I've been doing satire for 30 years, and immediately felt like an idiot. Now, it's true, I guess, but doing satire for 30 years is not like having the same drugstore under the same management at the same location for 30 years, and it's not really an argument, is it? It's like the movie star trying to get out of a ticket by saying, don't you know who I am? Only without the movie star part. And I was wrong. The truth of satire must be faced. I was equating satire with Colbert or The New Yorker. The ideal of high-minded wits taking down the high and mighty, Mark Twain, Jonathan Swift, Voltaire, a satirical Olympus for which I strived. But satire is not necessarily moral. It's a bundle of techniques: insult, invective, mockery, burlesque, sarcasm, parody, irony, puns. You internet commenters, when you label Obamacare Obamacare or call conservatives Republithugs, you are being satirical, bless your hearts. And satire can be fueled by spite or racism or vile and even affection. A good-natured poking, like a celebrity roast. The celebrity has to take horrible insults with a grin. Why? Beats me. In the dozens, the hope is that insults about somebody's mother will not lead to a fistfight. If it has, you've gone too far. Or maybe you've won. I don't know. Satire contains multitudes. From scorn to grudging respect, contempt to affectionate parody. In the Celtic tradition, satire is a weapon. It can actually kill you. Doesn't do that anymore. Let's take it back to the basics. You're in grade school. You call Bob a duty head. Bob says, am not. You've won. Your friends say, good one. Even better. The cute little girl who's really smart and sits behind you says, Bob really is a duty head. How observant of you. Oh, yeah, that's what satire means to me. But what if Bob says, you called me a duty head? I have to kill you now. Satire's not so funny anymore, is it? Or Bob calls his lawyers. Or Bob feels so bad about being called a duty head, he throws himself in front of the short bus. So now, instead of a wit, you're a bully, shunned by the community like Donald Trump. Oh, damn, I wish I hadn't said that. No, I made Donald Trump cry. Nobody wants to see that. You see where satire gets you? I gotta go.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2015.
Our executive producer is David Demarest.
The program is produced by Devin Strolovich. Laura McGuire is our director of research. Our marketing director is Dave Millar.
Thanks also to Ted Muldoon, Merle Kessler, Erica Topit, and Mark Stone.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University and the partners at our online community of thinkers.
And from the members of KALW San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org, where you too can become a partner in our community of thinkers.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.
The thing to remember about comedy is if it bends, it's funny. If it breaks, it's not funny.